Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Culkin's Truergy, also known as Byron of Sidious. This is American Minotaur, written by yours truly, Joshua T. Culkin's Truergy. Chapter 10. Titus nursed his first cup of coffee of the day, thankful that he hadn't overdone it on booze the prior evening at the Halloween party. It had been around midnight when Misha roused him from slumber with a tug on his right horn. She had already been up for about an hour, but she had left him to rest a little while she woke up with the help of an energy drink from the stash that Lynn had brought for the performance. When Titus ambled to his feet, the Kenpachi wig slipping free off his head, Misha scooped it up and led him back to her van. When she dropped him off at home, Henry having driven Titus's truck behind them, Titus said that he'd talk to her later, but Misha informed him that, between his game and whatever post-game plans he had, she probably wouldn't see him until Monday at the earliest. It's going to be kind of hit or miss the next couple of weeks, though, big guy. I got 6 different pickup shows to do around town, and then Christmas season's usually kind of booked solid. Do we just want to lock down lunch this Wednesday for right now, the usual? Yeah, that sounds good, he had replied, then dragged himself inside the house and up to his bed. When his dad biffed him over the face with a pillow in the morning to wake him up, Titus's response had been to throw his hands up over his head and groan. Dad, please tell me I'm not running late, Titus said. No, but you are still wearing that silly costume, bub. Come on, shake a leg. Mom's got breakfast going, John Jacobson said, tossing Titus's spare pillow toward the Minotaur's bare hooves, along with his caps. And you forgot to put your caps on when Mish dropped you off, he added, pointing down to a spot on the floor next to Titus's bed. Not a big deal. I'll buff the marks out later or tomorrow. Titus hopped out of bed, hit the bathroom, and quickly got dressed for the day, checking his gear bag was ready to take to the campus for the afternoon's game. Now, taking another sip of his coffee, Titus's eyes were drawn to John's hands as the older Jacobson man in the house settled down across from him at the table. Pulling extra jobs this last week, Dad? Maybe. What makes you guess that, son? Your hands. They're looking a little rough around the knuckles. I remember they looked like that a lot back when I started playing football in middle school, when you decided to get the Max machine for me. Made up my own phrase for it at the time, too. Overtime hands. Titus rolled his head to one side, cracking his neck. What gives? It's nothing I can't handle, Titus, John said, a faint edge creeping into his tone, a defensiveness that usually signaled that he didn't want to have any further discussion on a topic. Ricky just needed a little extra time off, is all. He's back on his full docket come Monday, and Sammy's covering weekend calls today and tomorrow. Titus didn't prod any further, finishing his first cup of coffee and fetching his second, before leaning back so that his mom could put his plate down in front of him. Thanks, Mom. Linda circled around and set John's in front of him. Thank you, honey. The Jacobsons ate their breakfast quietly, with only a brief question from Linda, inquiring how Titus felt his final classes were going. It feels kind of weird, Titus said, taking his empty plate over to the sink and rinsing it off quickly. After the Thanksgiving break, I've only got 2 classes to take through to the end of the year, with the exception of a couple of finals and a few sample case files to write up and present to my professors. I'm going to have a lot of gaps throughout the week. When he sat back down at the table, he found his parents had scooted their chairs around so that they were seated opposite him at the table. Speaking of weird, this feels kind of hinky, he said, leaning his hands down on the table rather than sitting down. What's going on? This came in the mail yesterday, John said, handing an envelope across the table to Titus. The young Minotaur took and turned it, reading the address stamped on it. It was from the Law Enforcement Training Academy at SUNY Erie Community College. Titus opened the envelope and read the enclosed letter from the head of instruction, which effectively informed Titus that the academy had been contacted by his professors at Buff State, and they had all universally recommended him for the accelerated training and clearance program. If he accepted the offer, he would not only be allowed to transfer classroom hours over to fulfill his quota in only 12 weeks instead of the standard 26, but he would also be extended an offer to join the Buffalo Police Department at the rank of sergeant immediately upon assignment, and be eligible to take the detective's exam in 6 months instead of a year. "Okay," Titus whispered to himself, handing the letter across the table to his parents and standing up, fetching himself one more cup of coffee. "It's kind of incredible, really," Titus said, pouring sugar and creamer into his mug and stirring. "The deadline to accept is January 14th, day before the cutoff to declare for the draft." "For the NFL," John added, still looking at the letter with Linda. "The UFL doesn't really do a draft of their own." That was an avenue that Titus hadn't even yet considered, even though he and his father enjoyed watching the Spring League. His dad set the offer letter down on the table slowly and looked Titus dead in the eyes, his cast perfectly somber in the moment. "You should take some time to think these things over, son. I know you haven't got a lot of that left now, but with it already being November 1st, only leaves you really a couple of months to figure out what you want to do." Titus took up the letter off the table, carefully put it back in its envelope, and took it up to his room, where he placed it on top of his dresser. For the time being, he only wanted to focus on one day at a time, and that meant finishing his coffee, grabbing his gear, and getting to the campus. "It's been nice having some folks to blend in with for a change," Ashkar said to O'Connell, as they sat on the bleachers near a clutch of Minotaurs who lived in the area and had come to the Buffalo State campus for the last 2 home games since Titus was being highlighted in the local sports papers, cheering on one of their own number. Several other regulars from the bar, degenerate gamblers, each and every one of them, had accompanied the 2 men to the day's game, because they all had a goodly amount of money in personal bets riding on several facets of the day's game. "Speak for yourself, Bull," O'Connell grumbled, pulling the scarf down from over his mouth. The unseasonable warmth of the week of Halloween had dropped off abruptly overnight. He took off one of his gloves and reached into a coat pocket, withdrawing a small notebook, flipping to about the halfway point, scrolling down his handwritten notes. Ashkar did the same, his own notebook looking a touch more worn down. "What have you got for sack totals?" "I've got a top line on my boy getting 3 at minimum, couple of takers on that for $100 pop," Ashkar said with a lurid grin. "Absolute suckers there. The kids had at least that many every game this season." "Sure, but have you seen the lineup for Calpern down there?" O'Connell asked, pointing toward the visiting team's sideline. Ashkar took a look that way, recognizing straight away his employer's concern. The Calpern University team appeared to have several lizardmen, hobgoblins, and even a Minotaur player of their own in uniform. "Your boy might actually be lined up against some guys who can match him pound for pound." Ashkar made a low noise in his throat, a wordless concern settling into the back of his mind. His deception with Titus hadn't been an entire sham, as he had, in point of fact, headed east for about a week after leaving the blasting rod with his biological son for safekeeping. He had gone to New York City on O'Connell's behalf, making connections with some of his old business ties, moved down years earlier out of Boston, and re-establishing elements of their less than legitimate business enterprises out of the Big Apple. O'Connell wanted to get in on a small slice of the action and make himself available to these former allies as a fence in the Buffalo area, and he sent Ashkar with the message and a duffel bag full of funds to buy his way in, if such proved necessary. Ashkar found the whole business less than ideal, as it ran counter to how he and his old crew back in Chaldea had normally conducted their own affairs. For them, It almost always boiled down to the threat or direct application of violence, and overtly wherever they set up shop. The Humes called the shots in most cases here on Earth, though, and he wasn't about to try out upsetting the balance of things when he was so sorely out of his element and outmanned. He had passed along the message, played nice, and paid the upfront cost of their required franchise fee without complaint, reporting back to O'Connell on the Thursday evening of that second week that the deal had been started in earnest. He had passed along a number for a burner phone that O'Connell was to call Monday morning at 9 a.m. to start going over the finer details, as well as informing his boss how much the fee had been. O'Connell had thanked Ashkar and told him he was free to take $15,000 out of the remainder from the duffel for himself as payment for this errand. The Minotaur hadn't balked, satisfied with the arrangement. He didn't try skimming any extra for his own purposes, though this was less out of any sense of honor and duty, and more out of a certainty that O'Connell would find him out if he tried anything funny. The guy was a Hume, yes, but he was shrewder than most of their kind. When Ashkar had gotten back to Buffalo on Friday in the early afternoon, O'Connell had been in a rush to get him working on the regulars at the bar to take down some bets on the next day's game. When he had taken a good number of wagers, the Southie native had called him into the back room of the bar for a word. "Hey, a lot of these bets last week and this week are based around your kid, Ash, and one of my eyeballs out there says the kid's gone off to some kind of Halloween party." "You've got an eyeball on Titus? Why?" "He has something that belongs to me in his house," O'Connell snorted, hands on his hips as if explaining to a child. "You think I'm not going to keep an eye on my investments? Anyway, I want to know, is he the sort you think is possibly going to start any shite at a party for a bunch of college kids and the like?" "Shit, no. He's got too much riding on keeping his nose clean," Ashkar replied without a thought. "He's going for a degree in criminal justice. Might even get scouted for the fucking NFL. You think he'd blow that after a couple of beers?" O'Connell pointed a finger out toward the main room of the bar. "Shit-faced Steve used to be a lawyer with a solid rep, boyo. Having a lot to lose doesn't mean anything if a fella's apt to be a numpty at a kegger." Ashkar held his ground, though, and shook his head slowly for emphasis. "All right. I'll call off the eyeball for tonight." Now, sitting in the stands for the game, Ashkar looked down at Titus's back where he stood with his fellow defenders on the Bengals' sideline, and hoped like hell that his boy wasn't hung over for the game. In the short term, there didn't appear to be anything much for Ashkar to be worried about, as Titus Jacobson snagged his fourth sack of the game just as the whistle blew to signal the end of the third quarter of play, securing him at least a few $100s in the benefit column of his Bet Lines notebook. Now, however, Ashkar had to hope that Buff State's kicker would boot through one more field goal, and that the end score would have Buff State put the game away by at least 4 points to beat the spread. They were up at the moment 28-18 over Calpern, but the Bengals' running back, a kid named Chambers, had gone down howling and holding his left leg halfway through the third quarter, and up until that point, the team had been leaning pretty heavily on him to pick up long stretches of yardage. Since then, their offense had slowed production to a near snail's pace, unable to cross Calpern's 40-yard line in the 3 possessions since then. Ashkar used the time between quarters to head into one of the nearby portable restrooms, and when he returned to his spot, one of the other Minotaur locals quirked an eyebrow at him. "Don't recognize you, bud," the stranger remarked, a specimen of their kind who was built only a little bit larger than Ashkar, which could have been an illusion cast by being dressed in a rather puffy black coat and knit cap with fitted holes for the horns. "You here to cheer on the Jacobson kid?" "Indeed I am," Ashkar said, careful not to indulge too much, slightly adjusting his frame so that he was aimed toward the field below, a subtle sign that he was disengaging from further dialogue. When the other Minotaur pressed no further, He let out a small sigh of relief and gratitude that here, apparently, was another native Chaldean Minotaur, one who understood the mannerisms and habits of their shared people. On the field below, the refs blew their whistles, and the final stretch of the game pressed on. "Jacobson!" a voice called from the office. The team's coaches all shared, just as Titus was finishing up putting on his street clothes after having toweled off. He finished pulling on his long black peacoat and zipped his duffel shut, leaving it on the bench as he headed to the door to the office. Inside, Coach Reynolds was at one of the two wide desks within, and an unfamiliar gentleman in a heavy black winter coat over a maroon polo and jeans sat in one of the guest chairs across from the defensive coach. "Come on in, shut the door," Reynolds said, which Titus did. "Titus, this is Brett Rhodes," Reynolds said. Rhodes stood up and faced Titus, offering him a hand, which Titus gently shook. "Mr. Rhodes is with the National Football League's Players Association." "Ah, I see," said Titus, taking half a step back and putting his hands in his coat pockets. "What can I do for you, Mr. Rhodes?" "For the moment, there's nothing you have to do for me, son," Rhodes said, his twangy southern accent thick, his smile bordering on predatory. "Although, if you wanted to go ahead and declare your intention to be part of the draft come next spring, that'd be mighty fine of you." Titus snickered awkwardly himself, looking down at the floor of the office. "I assure you, there's no pressure right now. I mostly wanted to swing in here and let you know that there's already been some scuttlebutt around the league about you, son. Plenty of teams that are in rebuilding mode who could use some lightning in a bottle to revitalize their defensive lines." "Trust me, my dad and I watch every Sunday, Monday, and Thursday, Mr. Rhodes," Titus said with a smirk. "We know the teams you're talking about." "Then you know that one of those teams is the Giants. Now, I know you're probably wishing you could stay pretty close to home here in the Buffalo area. That wouldn't really be all that bad, just the other side of the state. Give it some thought. The way they're looking this season, they'll end up with a pretty high draft position in the offseason, will the Giants." Titus plastered on a plastic grin at this and nodded, motioning toward the office door to excuse himself. Rhodes instead put his hands up and said, "No need to leave, Titus. I was just about to head out myself, and your coach here wanted a separate word with you. I'm just happy to have had the chance to speak with you momentarily." When Rhodes had quietly shut the door behind himself, Titus let a few moments of quiet just hang in the air before he took up the guest chair across from Coach Reynolds. "There's something else on your mind, isn't there, Coach?" Titus asked plainly. "I'm that easy to read, huh?" Reynolds scoffed, shaking his head. "Okay, yeah, there's a couple of things I wanted to go over with you, but neither should take very long to cover. For starters, Coach Aldern wanted me to pass along that he was quite impressed with your first half of the game, but he had to go." "Yeah, I noticed he wasn't on the sideline for the second half," Titus remarked. "Where'd he end up going off to?" "Well, that's sort of the second thing I wanted to talk to you about, Titus. Coach Aldern started having some shortness of breath, so he took himself to ECMC to get checked out. He didn't give me all the details just yet, but I've been on the phone with his wife since about 5 minutes were left of the game. He's not going to be able to come back for at least a month, son. He has some kind of infection in his left lung. For the time being, he's asked me to step in as acting head coach, so I'm going to need you to step up as the defensive captain and keep the rest of our boys in line for the last stretch of the season. You think you can handle that?" "Of course, sir," Titus said, sitting up slightly straighter in his seat. "Besides, we've only got 6 games left, Coach. It shouldn't be that hard." "Well, that's what I'm hoping, son. Anyways, that's all I needed. You had a great game out there, Titus." The young Minotaur left the coach's office and snagged his duffel, a faint throb settling in behind his left eye. "I can handle it," he thought. "It's just 6 weeks." If this had been his only source of high-level stress, Titus might even have been correct in his assessment, friends. But as this storyteller is fairly certain, you've already surmised, dear reader or listener, that he was quite wrong in that regard. How wrong? We'll get there.